Modernisms and Methodologies 3. People of Modernism. So this lecture will cover these areas: Bloomsbury, Edith Sitwell, Nancy Cunard, T.S. Eliot, and Ezra Pound, briefly. The Bloomsbury group. In the last lecture, there was a good amount of talk about the Bloomsbury neighborhood. And now, thinking about the different people who were part of that group, one of the things we notice is that there were writers and there were artists, but there was also the economist, John Maynard Keynes, and a journalist, Desmond McCarthy. This is the original group, and others were added, but it was a somewhat closed group called the Bloomsburys. So Virginia Woolf and her brothers were living in Gordon Square, and friends from college were invited round, and that's how the Bloomsbury group came to be. It was composed of upper middle class people who were highly educated, who were progressive in the way they thought about the world. They supported gay rights, women in the arts, pacifism. Many of them had open marriages and practiced a very free sexuality. And at the same time, they were considered snobbish and elitist. Roger Fry, one of the group, with 2 of his works. And most interesting is his Omega Workshop project, where he gathered a number of artists, and they agreed that they would sign their works only with the Greek letter Omega. They would not sign their names on these works. The Omega Project began in 1913, ended in 1919, but its influence continued through the 1920s. Another painting by Roger Fry of Edith Sitwell from 1918, and that makes a transition to Edith Sitwell. This photo is quite interesting, showing her as an eccentric personality with those huge rings and a tremendously large book on her lap, and with her face turned in profile. She was born in Renishaw Hall, which was not in London. She had a private governess, of course, and her family's portrait was painted by John Singer Sargent. You see her standing next to her father. Her mother's a good distance off, and her 2 younger brothers are playing in the lower right-hand corner of this painting. And behind them, of course, there's a tapestry and the lovely furniture. Now, Edith Sitwell was not very close to her mother, and Helen Rutham, the governess, provided some stability for her. The Sitwells had their property in Britain, but they also owned a castle in Florence. Edith Sitwell, being a woman, was not allowed to inherit any of the property or wealth of her family. This was divided between her 2 brothers, and that meant that during her lifetime she needed to write, to sell books, and to make money to live on. In 1913, I believe it was, she moved to London, and because it was not considered proper for a woman to live alone, she lived with her governess, Helen Rutham, who acted as a chaperone. Now notice these 2 portraits, both by Wyndham Lewis, 1921 pencil drawing, which was a preparation, no doubt, for this painting. But you notice in the painting, Edith Sitwell's hands are missing. And the reason is that apparently Lewis, yes, the same Wyndham Lewis of Blast magazine, Lewis had flirted with Sitwell, and Sitwell did not return his advances, and as a reprisal measure, he left her hands off the painting. This is a lovely photo by Cecil Beaton. Sitwell is very important for her contribution of Wheels anthologies. There were 5 or 6 of these published between 1916 and 1922, maybe. And these include a number of poets that were not published elsewhere. Nancy Cunard, for one. Helen Rutham, the governess, we find her there. Sitwell and her two brothers, of course, but they were published elsewhere. Sitwell's major works, the Wheels anthologies, which included Wilfred Owen's first set of poems. Facade, 1922, Gold Coast Customs, 1929, and Sitwell wrote important war poems during World War I, and she wrote other war poetry that was considered very important in World War II. This is her voice reciting.
Long steel glass, the white soldiers pass, the light is braying like an arse sea. The tall Spanish jade with hair black as nightshade, worn as a cockade flea. Her eyes gasconade and her gowns parade, as stiff as a brigade. The hard and braying light is zebra black and white, it will take away the slight and free. Tinge of the mouth organ sound, oysters all those oozing round her flounces as they sweep the ground. The trumpet and the drum and the martial call they come to make the people dumb, but we won't wait for strife at night, moonlight, water, milk white bright, to make clear the declaration of our Paphian location beside the Castanetti Sea, where stalks Il Capitano, Swagger, Braggadocio, sword and mustachio. He is green as a cassada, and his hair is an armada. To the J, come kiss me harder, he called across the battlements the she. Heard our voices thin and shrill as the steely grasses thrill, or the sound of the onika when the folk has the pika in the palace of the Queen Chinese.
From this recitation, you gather the tremendous attention that Sitwell paid to sound. Very interesting attention to vowels and how things rhyme and sounds. Nancy Cunard is a lesser-known figure, but she's gaining in popularity at the moment. Over the past 10 or 15 years, interest in her has been growing. She was part of the Corrupt Coterie. This is another London group, but a very high-profile society set. They had more money and more power than the Bloomsbury group. So their members included the son of the Prime Minister and a director of a bank, and Nancy Cunard and Iris Tree. Now, Nancy Cunard was a heiress to the owner of Cunard Shipping Lines. So normally she would have inherited a lot of money, and she did not have the same status as Edith Sitwell, because the money she would have inherited might have been American money, at least in part. It would have come through her mother. So, voilà. This group met at the Café Royal, which you saw a painting of in the prior lecture. So Cunard was born into a life of privilege, as I mentioned. She met a number of writers early on in her life. There was an early marriage, 1916, but that ended in divorce. She contributed to Edith Wheel's anthologies, and in fact, one of her poems suggested the title Wheels to Sitwell. She moved to Paris in 1920 and was known for her multiple amorous adventures. A lot of gossip surrounded her love life, and she was a very beautiful woman, as this photo suggests. Here she's wearing her collection of African bracelets. So she was a muse for a number of poets, and she had a strong interest in African art. She founded the Hours Press, and they printed Horoscope, 1930 by Beckett, Pounds, a draft of 30 cantos in 1930 as well. And she was living with an African-American pianist, Henry Crowder, whose music she also published. So this was an avant-garde press. Now, her mother, a member of the English High Society set, did not approve at all of her love relationship with an African-American. This was not done at the time, and the mother totally disapproved. This did not faze Nancy Cunard, who believed she had the right to her own choices, and she went with Henry Crowder to visit Harlem, and her interest in civil rights grew. So she began to collect materials for the Negro anthology that she had published in 1934. This is a photo of her with Henry Crowder at the press. And this is the Negro Anthology. This book has been reprinted in a facsimile edition, so exactly as it looked at the time. The first time the book was reprinted in the United States 2 or 3 decades ago, about a third of the book was not reproduced. And the original edition had become a rare book. It didn't sell very well when it was first published, unfortunately. And the extra copies of the book that did not sell burned during the Blitz when air raid strikes set things afire in London. The copies of the book burned. So it was quite a rare book until this 2018 facsimile edition. The book was dedicated to Henry Crowder, and here are a few photos of some parts of the book. Nancy Cunard herself reviewed Harlem. The first text of the volume is the poem I Too by Langston Hughes, with a facing photo of Hughes. And there's a number of poems by African-American poets. That's a photo of the table of contents. So Cunard included in her review of Harlem some Negro slang. W.E.B. Du Bois also was a contributor. So it's a wide-reaching volume and very interesting work. This work would be a valid topic for a master's thesis, given the right angle, so something to consider perhaps. Ezra Pound also contributed. Here's one of the photos of the Scottsboro boys. The Scottsboro trial being a very famous trial in U.S. history, or an infamous trial, if you like, in 1931, when 9 young men were accused of raping 2 white women. We shift now to Ezra Pound. This is his birthplace. He was born in this house in 1885 in Haley, Idaho. He attended the University of Pennsylvania and Hamilton College. He worked at university on medieval literature, classical literature, and after he had graduated, the widow of Ernest Fenollosa contacted him with her husband's manuscripts. He was already in Europe at that time, and that's how Pound also acquired Japanese and Chinese poetry as part of his literary baggage. So he went to London to meet the greatest living poet of the time, W.B. Yeats, and he worked as his secretary for 2 successive winters. I believe it was 1913 and 14, or 1912 and 13. And he married a woman named Dorothy Shakespeare, no E on that Shakespeare. And then he met T.S. Eliot in September of 1914. Soon he moved to Paris, where he lived in Montparnasse for about 3 years, and met his another love of his life, Olga Rudge. In about 1924, he moved to Italy and eventually settled in Rapallo. Here is his voice.
The thought of what America would be like if the classics had a wide circulation troubles my sleep. The thought of what America, the thought of what America The thought of what America would be like if the classics had a wide circulation troubles my sleep. Nunc dimittis. Now lettest thou thy servant, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. The thought of what America, the thought of what America, the thought of what America would be like if the classics had a wide circulation. Oh, well, it troubles my sleep.
I invite you to find Pound's first canto. It's on YouTube, and you can listen to him recite that canto. It's a great kind of introduction for your reading of the Pisan cantos. And I show you this because it's something very positive about Pound, I think. At the time that Kennedy was assassinated, when he found out, he took it upon himself to send a telegram to the White House. Given the other things you'll be learning about Pound, which may surprise and perhaps even shock you, it's nice to think about this telegram too. Now, a brief introduction to Eliot and the Wasteland, which you should be reading. The poem was published in 1922 and republished in 1923 at the Hogarth Press. It was published in several different places, so the Criterion, the Dial, these little magazines which were so essential for modernist texts. This poem is characterized by its free verse, lines of unequal length and rhythm, its foreign language phrases, where you don't get a translation, so if you don't understand, you have to look it up or live without. The use of mythology and foreign cultural references, classical literature, Dante, there are collage techniques, there's some Sanskrit, and here are some more recent covers for this work. One of the most famous works of the 20th century. So you have Eliot's classical education, which enters into this text, and you see the Dido theme in Two, a game of chess, and also in an earlier poem of Eliot's. You see this classicism again in the Fire Sermon with the Tiresias figure. The devastated civilization and yet a fragmented history of world culture is what you get in the poem, really. And notice the footnotes Eliot left for the reader. That is, they're not footnotes, but they're endnotes. And these are spurious. They're fake. He was sending the reader on wild goose chases to some extent. So there's something a bit humorous about that. The poem also draws from the Aeneid, the epic poem by Virgil. So you can better understand Eliot's allusions in The Wasteland by having some knowledge of the Aeneid. Okay, thanks for this lecture.